Well, that being said, why don't you head on over to Joshua 22. We'll start in the Old Testament. I'm excited for this. But before we do that, I want to show you a picture of a woman. We got that picture right there? Anybody remember who this is? Okay, all right. This woman's name is Susan Boyle. Back in 2009, she was the viral moment. And so back in 2009, she stepped up onto the stage of Britain's Got Talent, completely unknown contestant. I'm gonna be honest with you, she looks like somebody that would have put me in timeout when I was in the first grade. She does. She just, you look at her and you would not have assumed. Now, many of us, we already know her story a bit and we're gonna talk about it this morning. So you already know what to expect, but a lot of times we don't. And let's be honest, when it comes to a reality show, yeah, we like to see the really good performers, but we also really like to see, you remember William Hung? Anybody remember William Hung? We like to see the ones who show up there and they're like, I had no idea I couldn't sing. It's a disgusting part of our internal being, but we have it, right? So we see her walk up there. She's just from a small village in Scotland. She spent her whole life caring for her mom. Her mom, needed help. She wasn't dressed like a celebrity. She seemed very awkward standing there talking to the judges, and they asked her what her dream was, and she said she wants to be a professional singer. And the audience doesn't believe her. You can go and you can look up this video clip. Everybody's laughing when they see her walk out there. And then it goes over to the judges, and the judges are kind of rolling their eyes, and they're looking at each other. You can tell even the judges are expecting. They are prejudging. That's where you get the word prejudice from. And then the music starts, and she starts singing I Dreamed a Dream from Les Mis. Look, if I didn't already offend you, maybe this will. I don't really like Les Mis. I mean, it means the miserable ones, and that's how I feel every time I watch it. It is so depressing. But this rendition is so beautiful. And you can watch the change happen. You can see it in the eyes, you can see it in the body language of the audience and the judges as they start realizing, oh, this lady's for real. And as they look over there, they are leaning in. She gets massive marks, and she goes on, and I mean, she's been very successful. By the way, just as a fun fact, she never even moved out of that small town. She's about 20 miles west of Edinburgh, and she just, instead of buying a mansion, she bought the house next to her and then connected them and just stayed in her own little town. It's kind of crazy the way that she decided to do this. But Susan Boyle is a good window to look at today's message through. Because a lot of times you see somebody and you start to fill in the gaps. When the audience saw her, they automatically said, oh, we're about to get a really bad singer. We're about to laugh. No, you weren't. You were about to cheer for her. It's really interesting because Susan Boyle didn't become more talented in those 3 minutes that she was singing a song than she was before that. The only thing that changed was people's opinion because they listened and they had more information. They had looked at her appearance and they had listened to a few sentences and convinced themselves they already knew her story. I don't think this was a problem for Susan Boyle. I think this is a humanity problem. We do it all the time. Somebody walks past us after church and they don't say hello and we decide that they're upset with us. Somebody leaves a ministry and we become convinced that we know exactly why. Somebody says something that comes across a little harsh, and before we've ever had a conversation with them, we've already assigned a motive to their action. So we're not just observing what happened, we're actually writing the story ourselves and filling in all the details that we don't actually know. And we don't call that judgmentalism, we call that discernment. Discernment is a gift from the Lord, but just because you feel like you know details doesn't actually make it discernment. And this gets even worse when you've known somebody, because then when somebody says something good, you're like, well, you don't know them like I do. Thank God that they don't know them like you do, because we have a tendency to pick up biases as we go along the way too, don't we? So we tell ourselves we're just good at reading people, and we're convinced that we figured them out. As it turns out, this is not a new problem. Long before television shows or social media, the people of Israel nearly went to war because of something. I'm excited to share this story in Joshua 22 for two reasons. First of all, in this series, as we're talking about the open secret of sin, and we're trying to tackle things that the church in general tolerates or applauds, I want you to also understand this. I have never heard this story preached. And that's pretty rare. Maybe you have. It's not a competition. I don't want to know. I have never heard this story preached before, and the Lord really placed this on my heart. I hope that this helps paint this. So I want you to have a little backstory before we read this. At this point in the Old Testament, Moses has died. Joshua was the one being mentored by Moses, and Joshua has faithfully led the people across the Jordan River. After years of battles, the promised land has finally been conquered. What you do need to know is that the tribes are beginning to settle into their inheritance that God had promised Abraham centuries earlier. After centuries of slavery, generations of slavery in Egypt, decades of wandering in the wilderness, and years of fighting to possess the land, now Israel is finally home. So this should be a really good moment for them. But not every tribe was going to settle in the same place, because before Moses died, the tribes of Reuben and Gad and the half tribe of Manasseh asked if they could inherit land on the eastern side of the Jordan River. And Moses agreed, but only on one condition. He said, yeah, you can settle here on this side of the river, but you need to still continue with us and help us conquer the rest of the promised land. Once we've conquered the whole promised land, then you can return to the land you want for your own. And they said, sweet, good deal, we're in. So that's what they do. They help them conquer it. All the land has been gotten now, but these guys are now settling in back over on the other side of the river. Now, on the journey home, something happened that changed everything. We're going to read a few verses here and there, starting in verse 10. It says, while they were still in Canaan, and when they came to a place called Gileath, near the Jordan River, the men of Reuben, Gad, and the half tribe of Manasseh stopped to build a large and imposing altar. The rest of Israel heard that the people of Reuben, Gad, and the half tribe of Manasseh had built an altar at Gileath at the edge of the land of Canaan, on the west side of the Jordan River. So the whole community of Israel gathered at Shiloh and prepared to go to war against them. Now, you may be saying, well, why war? They're just building an altar. Well, because there was one altar. There was one altar of the Lord where sacrifices were to be made in this era of Israel's existence. And to be fair, they're not really reacting out of nowhere. Throughout the law, God repeatedly warned Israel about establishing rival places of worship, because false worship has always been the doorway to idolatry. And they remembered what happened to Baal of Peor and all of these other things that you're about to read about. So for the rest and most of Israel, they're seeing this altar get built, and all of a sudden they're like, great, we're in the promised land, and they're bringing idolatry into the promised land, the very thing that we drove out. So they just said, you know what? We're going to have to take them out. Go over to verse 15. When they arrived in the land of Gilead, they said to the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and the half tribe of Manasseh, the whole community of the Lord demands to know why you are betraying the God of Israel. Isn't that interesting? The whole community. You ever have somebody come up to you and say, people are saying, and then you're like, who are people? Oh, well, I don't think it'd be appropriate for me to tell you. The next time that happens, you say, well, I don't think this conversation is appropriate either. Anyway, they said, how could you turn away from the Lord and build an altar for yourselves in rebellion against him? Was our sin at Peor not enough? To this day, we're not fully cleansed of it, even after the plague that struck the entire community of the Lord. These are all things that are documented that you can read. It says, and yet today you're turning away from following the Lord. If you rebel against the Lord today, he will be angry with all of us tomorrow. I will say this, I miss the day when we were a little bit more bold and we were willing to say, hey, people of God, this is not okay. I love you, I'm not casting you out, but this is not all right. I mean, we need a little bit more of this, don't we? Then they said, if you need the altar because the land you possess is defiled, then join us in the Lord's land where the tabernacle of the Lord is situated and share our land with us. But do not rebel against the Lord or against us by building an altar other than the one true altar of the Lord our God. Didn't divine anger fall on the entire community of Israel when Achan, a member of the clan of Zerah, sinned by stealing the things set apart for the Lord? He was not the only one who died because of his sin. This is the priest, this is Phinehas, and to be honest, this speech sounds pretty convincing. This could be a political rally. He is passionate and he is sincere and he really means it. He's trying to protect God's people. He does not have an agenda other than to protect God's people from idolatry. And he doesn't want them to repeat the mistakes that had already brought judgment on God's people, assuming that his conclusion is correct. Because then the eastern tribes finally get the opportunity to explain why they built the altar in the first place. Verse 21. The people of Reuben, Gad, and the half tribe of Manasseh answered the heads of the clans of Israel, and they said, the Lord, the mighty one, is God. The Lord, the mighty one, is God. He knows the truth, and may Israel know it too. Oh my gosh, I love this so much. You know what I'm gonna start saying? Man, the Lord knows the truth, and may you know it too. That's a good comeback, right? You're welcome. They said this, "We've not built the altar in treacherous rebellion against the Lord. If we have done so, do not spare our lives this day. If we've built an altar for ourselves to turn away from the Lord, or to offer burnt offerings or grain offerings or peace offerings, may the Lord himself punish us. The truth is, we built this altar because we fear that in the future, your descendants will say to ours, 'What right do you have to worship the Lord, the God of Israel?' The Lord has placed the Jordan River as a barrier between our people, and you people of Reuben and Gad, you have no claim to the Lord. So your descendants may prevent our descendants from worshiping the Lord. So we decided to build the altar not for burnt offerings or sacrifices, but as a memorial." It's not even a real altar. They said this, "It will remind our descendants and your descendants that we too have the right to worship the Lord at his sanctuary with our burnt offerings, sacrifices, and peace offerings. Then your descendants will not be able to say to ours, 'You have no claim to the Lord.' If they say this, our descendants can reply, 'Look at this copy of the Lord's altar that our ancestors made. It's not for burnt offerings or sacrifices. It is a reminder of the relationship that both of us have with the Lord. Far be it from us to rebel against the Lord or turn away from him by building our own altar for burnt offerings, grain offerings, or sacrifices. Only the altar of the Lord, our God, that stands in front of the tabernacle may be used for that purpose." Well, see, the whole story suddenly changes once you actually have a conversation with the other side of it. That altar had never been intended as a rival place of worship, not for idolatry, and not as an alternative source for the Lord. They understood the way that it worked. They're actually kind of forward thinking. And by creating this altar in such detail, they would be able to say, "Look, does it not match what the altar that you have over there is?" Because you got to remember, baggage is really heavy for most people, right? Well, what happened? Originally had Joseph, who was second in command of Egypt, saved everybody's lives, and then it said eventually a Pharaoh came up who knew nothing about Joseph or his people. Sometimes enough time goes by that we tend to forget all of the good and we tend to forget how the Lord has moved, and now we use our discernment. So they're saying, you know what, we don't want this to happen. We want to be honest, and we want to make sure that we're included. I don't think that we're all that different today, guys. We watch somebody's behavior, or we hear one conversation, or we read one social media post, or we notice just one decision, and before we've had a single conversation with them, we have supplied the motives ourselves. And that's the first thing that I want to talk about today, is that judgmentalism always assumes motives. Always assumes motives. It's one of the most dangerous things you can do. We'll be in 1 Samuel 17 in a few minutes if you'd like to read along in person. But let me ask you this. Have you ever had one of those moments where you became absolutely convinced that you knew what someone was thinking, only to find out later that you could not have been more wrong? Anybody? Just Mike? Okay. Myself too, right? Happens all the time. So I want you to imagine this happening on a Sunday morning. I touched on this earlier. You know, you walk through the lobby, someone you've known for years walks right past you, so you smile and you wave and they don't even acknowledge you, they just keep walking. By the way, has that ever happened to anybody here? Right? Okay. Then after service, you notice they leave without stopping to talk to you, and by the time you get home, you started putting the pieces together. They're upset about something. Maybe it was something that you said, maybe it was that one sarcastic remark that you made. Maybe they've been talking about you to someone else. Oh, well, I have noticed they've been getting closer to that person, and that person doesn't like me, so now they probably don't like me too. Good job, Sherlock. You have not had one single conversation with them about it, but somehow you've already built the entire story. A few days later, maybe you discovered that their father suffered a stroke that morning. And they weren't ignoring you at all. They were distracted, overwhelmed, and trying to hold themselves together, and they actually made it to church on a day that most of us wouldn't have. Nothing you observed was incorrect, right? Every single action that you saw in that scenario was correct. They really did walk past you. They really did leave early. The problem wasn't what you saw. The problem was everything you added to what you saw. So I think that's one of the easiest traps for us to fall into, because our minds don't like unanswered questions. We just don't. How many of you have been in the middle of a TV show and you start to look up, okay, like, does this person die on the TV show? Or what happens to so-and-so? Tell the truth. Okay, what about a book? You know? Yeah. So we do this sometimes. We don't like unanswered questions. That's exactly what happened in Joshua 22. Israel didn't invent the altar. The altar was already there. They saw it. They just didn't really know the reason, and all it took was a question. Phinehas, the priest, he gave them a whole speech. He didn't even ask them. He just gave them a speech, and they said, okay, can we get a word in edgewise? The same thing happens to these biblical figures again in one of the most familiar stories in the Old Testament, but this time it happens inside of a family. not a group for worship. If you've arrived at 1 Samuel 17, we are talking about what happens just before David and Goliath. Whenever we think about this chapter, we immediately think about slaying the giant, right? 5 smooth stones. What does that mean? Who are the giants in my life? And how do I conquer them? And how does the Lord bring me the battle? And that's all good stuff. That's for a different sermon. David, you need to know, is still the youngest son in Jesse's family. He is spending his days watching the sheep, while his brothers get to do the cooler stuff. As a matter of fact, the 3 oldest brothers are serving in King Saul's army. This would have been every little boy's dream at that point. They wanted to serve in the king's army. They wanted armor. They wanted swords. They wanted battles. And he is the sheep guy. And one day, his father Jesse says, hey, I know you get tired of watching the sheep. This is my interpretation. You want to do something else? And he's like, yeah, do I? And he's like, cool, here's some cheese. And here's some bread. I want you to take this to your brothers because they're probably hungry. The very first Grubhub in Scripture. And so he door dashes this over to them. He doesn't get a chance to chase glory or anything. He's not really trying to prove himself. He's just obeying his father and delivering lunch. And so when David arrives on the battlefield, Goliath comes out, and if you know the story, you know that he starts mocking God's people, and David starts asking the soldiers why no one is standing up to him. He's looking at all of these people that are trained for battle, and they said, this giant is cursing the people of God. Who's going to answer him? He's shocked, because think about it. If you're a little boy at home, and then you get to show up on the front lines, what do they say? Like, never meet your heroes, right? So then he's out there. He's like, I can't wait to meet these brave men of God. And he shows up with this cheese. And he feels like he's the bravest one there. So he starts asking what's happening. Why is nobody standing up to Goliath? And his oldest brother, Eliab, overhears the conversation. David has just heard that whoever can kill this giant will receive one of the king's daughters as a wife and be exempt from ever paying taxes. How many of y'all are ready to kill a giant today? Okay, all right. And David asked the soldier standing nearby, what will a man get for killing this Philistine and ending his defiance of Israel? And then he says this, who is this pagan Philistine anyway that he's allowed to defy the armies of the living God? What a great thing to say. There's nothing wrong with what he said, except that his older brother heard him, and man, it's hard to get on the same page as your sibling right now. If you're here with your siblings today, sorry. All right. These men gave David the same reply. They said, yes, that is the reward for killing him. And when David's oldest brother, Eliab, heard David talking to the men, he was angry. What are you doing around here anyway? He demanded. What about those few sheep you're supposed to be taking care of? Emphasis mine. I know about your pride and deceit. You just want to see the battle. He didn't even say thank you for the cheese. David said, what have I done now? I was only asking a question. He walked over to some others and asked them the same thing and received the same answer. He's trying to figure out what's going on because he can't understand why warriors aren't warring. One of the saddest parts in the story is that Eliab never questions what David is doing. He questions why David is doing it. Could you imagine if Eliab said, why are you asking that question? You got an idea? This guy's pretty scary. Have you seen him? He's got extra fingers and toes. This guy's big. Do you have ideas? Instead, he's just like, I know why you're asking it. That's where the danger comes in. That's when you know it's not discernment and it's judgmentalism. The irony is that we know something that Eliab doesn't. We've already been told why David is there. His dad sent him to bring them ancient Lunchables. More than that, God himself is actually orchestrating a moment because David is about to face Goliath and become the greatest example of faith in the Old Testament. Eliab couldn't see any of that because he had already convinced himself that he understood. The second you've convinced yourself you already understand someone or a situation, you have closed the door to any new information. Isn't that a little terrifying when you think of it like that? I wonder how many relationships have been strained because we've done exactly the same thing. We didn't just notice what they did, we just decided why they did it. We assume they were trying to hurt us, and then we say, well, I'll just put distance there. They won't hurt me again. Or we assume they wanted attention, or they had selfish intentions, or we assume they don't care. I'm not even going to ask for a show of hands this time, but I want you to ask yourself if you've ever watched somebody walk up to the altar and start worshiping and thought, they don't mean it. You're welcome for not asking for your hands. You know, there was a man who lived most of his life in complete obscurity. He was not an Olympian or a celebrity, wasn't even a police officer, even though he wanted to. He was a 33-year-old security guard. His name was Richard Jewell. Anybody know that name? Got a couple people? Good. He was a security guard working at the 1996 Summer Olympics in Atlanta. And if you remember those Olympics, you'll remember that Centennial Olympic Park, because that was the gathering place for visitors all over the world. And it wasn't just where the Olympics happened. They had like concerts and music events and different things happening in the evenings. And so the atmosphere was one giant celebration. People from all over the world, athletes, spectators, things like that. And on the night of July 27th that year, one of those concerts was taking place. And it looked like any other evening, except Richard Jewell walked through the crowd and he noticed something that didn't seem right. Underneath the bench near one of the concert stages was a military-style backpack that nobody seemed to notice and nobody knew where it came from. And so he alerted law enforcement and he started helping the police officers move and relocate people away from the bench. And it's a good thing he did, because that backpack exploded. It had a pipe bomb inside of it. And it ripped through the park. It killed a woman, injured more than 100 others, and another man later died of a heart attack while they were rushing to try to cover the story. Investigators said that Richard Jewell's actions saved many lives because he began clearing that area before the explosion ever happened. And for the next couple of days, if you remember from back then, America celebrated. This guy was like, he was the hero. But after a couple of days, the whole story started to change. Why? Because they didn't know who put the backpack there. So now it became leaked that one of the stories they were looking into was, did Richard Jewell put that backpack there so that he could alert others, so that he could be a hero? Because he had always wanted to be a police officer. He had always wanted to be a hero. He had always wanted to do these things. Before you know it, they're interviewing people that watched him grow up. They're asking them what they think of his motives. This guy loses his job, and it takes months for things to clear up for Richard Jewell. After 88 days of investigation, the Justice Department finally cleared Richard Jewell. He had never planted the bomb. Years later, authorities would capture the real bomber. His name was Eric Rudolph. And he confessed not just to that bombing, but to several other ones too. Richard Jewell had been exactly who people first believed he was. He was a man who saw danger, acted courageously, saved lives. But we're suspicious people, aren't we? And so we love a heroic story, and we love watching somebody do something amazing and have an achievement, but we love watching them fall too. It's pretty gross. And so we love seeing him save all of these people. Oh, but wasn't it a delicious story to think that the very hero was the villain, was the one that had placed it there? And then we started talking about it like we knew Richard Jewell. This is what happened back in 1996. I was 13 years old and I was still talking about it with people because it makes for a great story. TV has maybe ruined us in a couple ways, hasn't it? But here's the thing. While this happens, he still carries the stigma. He still carries it along with him. And so this man who was accused had a real trouble getting gainful employment again, either because they knew who he was too famous, or because they didn't trust him, or they hadn't heard all the details. You also have to keep in mind in the 90s, we didn't have all of this news coming straight to our phone with push notifications. Tragically, in 2007, he was just 44 years old. He died from complications related to heart disease and all of that. He never really got to live out his dream, even though he saved so many people. I've always thought it's pretty heartbreaking because people didn't just evaluate what he did, they became convinced that they knew why he did it. I think this is one of the reasons why I think that judgmentalism has become such an open secret in the church, because very few Christians would say, I'm a judgmental person. We know we're not supposed to be judgmental, so we wouldn't say it. But we've become very good at giving it a more respectable name, so we call it discernment a lot of times. We call it wisdom, we call it conviction. And sometimes those things really are biblical. The problem is when we believe that we have all of the information on why we feel conviction. A lot of times I'll get a red flag when I'm talking to somebody, and I just think it means I'm supposed to be on my guard and intercede and pray for them. But I know sometimes people say like, oh, I get a weird feeling around them, so I avoid them. You know what normally happens? That person feels avoided. They feel more and more like an outcast. They act weirder and weirder. You get more and more red flags because now you feel weird around this person and they're feeling weird, and before you know it, there's a blow up and you're like, I knew it. You actually helped create it. That's the way that it goes. It is possible to possess discernment without becoming judgmental, but it is also possible to become judgmental while convincing yourself that you have discernment. Here's what I mean. The difference is that discernment evaluates what God has clearly spoken about. Judgmentalism goes beyond what God has said and starts assigning motives or measuring how spiritual they are. This means we need to be honest enough to ask where this temptation shows up in our own lives. So, a couple questions here that we need to ask ourselves. Sometimes it shows up in the way that Christians celebrate holidays. Let's talk about that. Or choose not to. Maybe one family puts up a Christmas tree and another one doesn't. Or one family celebrates Halloween by handing out candy and another one keeps their lights off and spends the evening praying. The problem isn't that Christians come to different convictions. The problem is that we are under different convictions about their convictions. Romans 14 makes room for this. Paul writes this: one person considers one day more sacred than another. Another considers every day alike. Each of them should be fully convinced in their own mind. Why doesn't he just tell us? What are the parameters for a holiday that we can celebrate? You may not know this, but the Bible doesn't tell you to celebrate Halloween. It also doesn't tell you to celebrate Christmas. It's not a command. It's a cultural thing that we've got here. Sometimes we've got, not sometimes, every year we put some lighted trees up here around the end of the year, and there's always somebody who's like, I wish you didn't have those up there. They have pagan origins. Did you know that pagans have God origins? Those pagans were created in the image of God. Those trees were created because God created them and said they were good before somebody decided to do something different with it. I don't live in fear over what other people do. I don't send my kids trick-or-treating though. I just think it's weird to tell them all year, don't take candy from strangers. But on this one, I'm like, it's okay, they're wearing a mask. Do it this time. Enjoy your ride in that white van on the way home. I'd never do it. So that's why I don't do it. But it's not a religious thing. Traditions are weird, aren't they? Don't get me started on the bone collector that we call the tooth fairy. All right, the moment that judgmentalism enters the picture is when we stop saying this is my conviction and we start saying anyone who loves Jesus would do it my way. Sometimes judgmentalism shows up in thinking about what people watch or listen to or read. One believer won't watch a particular movie, another one has no issue with it. One family avoids certain music and another family feels free to enjoy it with wisdom. Scripture teaches us to guard our hearts, but it also warns us not to condemn one another over matters of a conscience. I remember hearing one family tell me, this house is safe for little ears. No rated R movies in this house. And I'm like, well, don't let them read the Bible, right? And then we had a movie come out. I believe it was in 2004. Anybody ever hear of a little movie called The Passion of the Christ? Big fat R rating right there. And they watched it as a family. I said, what happened? Because I'm an instigator. What happened in the R rating? And they're like, well, this one had Jesus in it. I remember asking one person one time, they were like, we don't watch any movies with witches in it. And I said, oh, cool. And I said, did you ever watch Wizard of Oz with your kids? And they said, oh yeah, but that was a different time, it was an older movie. I said, okay, because Glenda says, are you a good witch or a bad witch? What's your conviction? Okay, so I'm not here to tell you what to watch and what not to. That's literally the whole point of this. Paul writes this in Romans 14:3, just a couple verses ahead of where we were a moment ago. He says, those who don't eat certain foods must not condemn those who do, for God has accepted them. Now, the issue in the book of Romans there is food, and if it's been sacrificed to a false god or to a demon or something like that, but the principle applies far beyond food. We cross a line when we assume we know somebody else's spiritual maturity based solely on a playlist or a television show or a movie they watched without ever knowing the convictions that they have. There are movies I've been convicted to not watch or walk out of that y'all would be like, oh, that's fine to me, and probably vice versa. I'm not here to be the mediator between you and God. I don't know if you've heard, but there is one. Anyway, sometimes it also shows up in outward appearances. Churches have divided over hair length, tattoos, piercings, hats, what parts of skin can be shown, whether you wear suits and dresses or 1,000 other external things. But when Samuel was ready to anoint Israel's next king, God reminded him of this. People judge by outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. That doesn't mean that outward choices never matter. When we go to Guatemala, the ladies on that team will also bring some longer skirts because we honor the culture and what is normal in that culture. Right? We do that. If you show up to church here, you just want to attend here, I'm pretty okay with what you wear. Please don't show up in a bikini. Michael. But One time was one time too many. This never really happened, okay? Just never really happened. Please don't show up with the intention to draw eyes to you. But if you see somebody show up wearing something you wouldn't wear, don't assume that their intent is to have eyes drawn to them either. Leave them alone with their God. All right? Sometimes, if we're honest, judgmentalism shows up in something that is as simple as perceived disrespect. Somebody walks past us, like I talked about, without speaking, or what they say just hits us the wrong way. And so I would just remind you that James gives us some very simple advice in James chapter 1, verse 19. He says, understand this, my dear brothers and sisters. You must all be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to get angry. I want to talk to the people who swear by that verse. Quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to get angry. You got two slows for one quick, okay? Take your time. Relationships are that important. I think that's probably the challenge for us this week. The next time you find yourself saying, I know why they did that, I want you to ask yourself one question. Do I actually know, or have I simply written the missing chapters? It's just fan fiction. Because only one person has ever looked into a human heart and been right 100% of the time, and his name is? Jesus. Welcome to VBS, we all got it right. So we talked a lot about judgmentalism. Let's talk about discernment before we wrap up this morning. What is discernment then? Well, discernment always asks better questions. The next part should feel like a breath of fresh air for those of us who have been feeling some conviction. If judgmentalism assumes motives, then what does biblical discernment actually look like? This is not really a sermon about ignoring sin or pretending that everything's okay. Discernment is a biblical command. It's also a biblical gift. So we're called to test what we hear, recognize false teaching, and to exercise wisdom. But the answer isn't to stop discerning. The answer is to discern the way that Jesus did. So one of the biggest differences between judgmentalism and discernment is judgmentalism is satisfied with the appearances. You don't ask the questions, but discernment is willing to slow down long enough to seek understanding. Judgmentalism doesn't need to seek understanding. It already has it. But discernment recognizes there are parts that we have not heard yet. Can you imagine what that would do to a church if we never assumed a motive or intent or a heart posture of anybody in our church? Can you? That's the church I want to go to. I'm gonna be honest with you. If I heard that that church existed in Havelock, y'all wouldn't even see me here right now. I'd be over there worshiping. But this is impossible to do without the Holy Spirit inside of us. So this is the goal. This is the challenge. Imagine walking into a church where people didn't immediately assume the worst about one another. I want you to imagine a church where somebody stepping away from a ministry wasn't immediately met with rumors. It was met with, oh, I guess their season shifted. I want you to imagine husbands and wives who asked, help me understand what you're feeling before assuming that they already knew. I want you to imagine parents that became curious about their kids before they got angry with them. Or just friendships where people believe the best about one another until facts prove otherwise. But the fact is, we're too afraid of getting betrayed by our friends and our family and our church and our pastors and our politicians. Actually, we've already assumed that one. But we're too afraid of getting betrayed to actually offer trust. But the answer isn't to offer blind trust, it's to ask better questions. Jesus was so good at this. But I really believe that's one of the reasons why the early church was so compelling to the world around them. They were not known for believing the right things. If they were known for that, then the outside world would have believed the same things they did. They weren't known for that. They were known for the way that they loved one another. How many of y'all have almost been talked out of your faith from a Christian? Okay. That kind of community in the early church can only exist when people are willing to replace assumptions with conversations. That's why we have the saying here, and I don't care if you're sick of it. Conflict means conversation. We abide by that here. We need to, because if you don't have a conversation, you don't have the information. This church was known for the way they loved each other, and when I think about that, I cannot help but think about Jesus. We'll be in Mark chapter 10. No one who has ever lived possessed greater discernment than the Son of God. And Jesus never guessed what was in anybody's heart because he already knew. As a matter of fact, one of my favorite scriptures, it says, Jesus loved them, but he didn't trust them because he knew all about people. I'm like, oh, I feel that. But listen, Jesus knew people's thoughts before they spoke. He knew their past, he knew their struggles, he knew their motives with perfect accuracy. If anyone who ever lived had the right to skip the questions and move straight to the conclusion, it was Jesus. And that's not the way that Jesus chose to minister. So, in Mark 10, Jesus is making his final journey towards Jerusalem. Crowds are surrounding him. He is known for miracles, and he's going through the city of Jericho, and sitting beside the road is a blind beggar named Bartimaeus. When Bartimaeus realizes that Jesus is passing, he begins crying out for mercy, and the people around him tell him to be quiet because in their minds, he isn't worth interrupting Jesus. But Bartimaeus refuses to stop calling out, and eventually Jesus does something that changes the whole story. Check this out, verse 46. When they reached Jericho, and as Jesus and his disciples left town, a large crowd followed him. A blind beggar named Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, was sitting beside the road. When Bartimaeus heard that Jesus of Nazareth was nearby, he began to shout, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." "Be quiet," many of the people yelled at him. Church folk. And he only shouted louder. He said, "Son of David, have mercy on me." When Jesus heard him, he stopped and he said, "Tell him to come here." And this is my interpretation. I picture all those Pharisees, all those church folk going, "Oh, that's a good idea, Jesus. Yeah, I was just about to get him." "Bartimaeus, there you are, buddy. Come on, hey. Have you eaten today? Do you want a sandwich?" All right. He said, "Tell him to come here." So they called the blind man and they say to him, "Cheer up. Come on, he's calling you." These people have probably never encouraged Bartimaeus a day in their life. Bartimaeus threw aside his coat, jumped up, and came to Jesus. And then Jesus asked something that used to confuse me. He says, "What do you want me to do for you?" Is that not a little confusing? I mean, you got the Son of God who's known for healing people, physical healings, doing these miracles, and a blind man is brought over to him and he's like, "So, how can I help you today?" Well, he says, "My rabbi, I want to see." And Jesus said to him, "Go, for your faith has healed you." And instantly the man could see. And he followed Jesus down the road. I was always fascinated by that question, "What do you want me to do for you?" Because at first it does feel strange. Jesus is standing in front of a blind man. I want you to imagine somebody walks up to you. They're only wearing pants, their ribs are showing, and you have this like foot-long sub. And you're like, "What do you want?" Okay? Jesus is standing there. He knows the answer. And even if it wasn't obvious to all the eyes around them, Jesus has perfect discernment, right? So why does he ask? I don't think Jesus asked that question of Bartimaeus because he needed the information. I think he asked it because he wanted to give Bartimaeus something that the crowd had never given him. He wanted to make sure that this person knew he was not a burden. Pun intended, he wanted this man to feel seen. Discernment asks questions. Every single spiritual gift you're ever given is not for you. If you're given an interpretation, it's so that you can interpret what somebody else says. If you're given a gift of healing, it's not for your own boo-boo. It's for somebody else's injury. If you're given some sort of gift, it's always for someone else. Can you imagine? I have the gift of leadership. Oh, well, who do you lead? It's for me. It's a special little gift that God gave me. I'm my own little leader. I don't leave the house. I don't like people. Oh, okay. Good job, leader. Think about it. Gives you the gift of giving. I'm very giving. Who do you give to? Well, I'm waiting for the right moment. Really, you look like a hoarder. So every spiritual gift you were ever given is for somebody else. So when God gives you discernment about somebody, why is it that that's the moment that we assume that that's for our own personal knowledge? Oh, God gave me this gift of discernment so that I would know to stay away from that person. I hope they go to heaven, but I won't be a part of the process. That really is what you're saying. What would happen if then God's like, "Hey, there's something going on with Cody," and you're like, "I bet there is." No, we're laughing, but that's what we do. We get this feeling, we call it a check in our spirit. That's not even biblical language, but that's modern Christian language. I have a check in my spirit about that person. Cool, check it off. It's a list now. Go and check it off. Cody, you doing all right? The voice says yes, but the heart says no. That's what it means. A lot of times we as Christians, we're like, I just have this empathy burnout. I can't ask everybody how they're doing. I can't be there for everyone. No, but you can be there for the ones that God has laid on your heart. And if you would go there and be there for the people that God laid on your heart, and you would do the same thing, and you would do the same thing, everybody would be covered. Even your discernment is not for you, but it is from God. And you and I, we have to know how to steward that. Okay? Jesus looked at this man and he said, "Tell me what you need." Could he not have just, from where he was, oh, Bartimaeus is crying out, "God, would you heal him so I can keep going? I've got a mission." He didn't do it. I've been guilty of avoiding somebody in Walmart before. I'm going down one aisle, I'm like, well, I guess I'm going around the meat department. I've done it. And I know I'm not the only person. I've done it because it's been a day and God knows my heart, which should also be terrifying, right? Because he knows the moments that I've been callous and cold and removed from people. I'm so afraid that he's gonna make me be there for somebody I don't have the energy for. God would never do that. But he would give you the mission that you are equipped for. So learn to listen to him. The church should be the safest place in the world for us to tell the rest of our story. This should be the place that you can walk in and say, I need to see. This should be the place that you should be able to walk in and say, I am so jealous. I am so prideful. I am struggling with envy. This should be the place that you could walk in and be like, here are all of my problems. Somebody help me. And instead we walk in and we're like, I'm blessed and highly favored. And then you side-eye your spouse and you're like, we'll talk about this in the car. Would it not, can we not walk in and be like, hey, how are you guys doing today? And then you just say, you know what? My wife and I are fighting. And we're gonna get through it, we always do, but man, we could use some prayer. Oh, what a scandal. Because you know what we're afraid of? Then somebody's gonna go like, I heard Blake and Cassie are fighting. And then people go, oh, fighting in a marriage? You know what's cool? This morning, I was just standing right over there. My friend Andrew right there, he's like, how are you doing? I'm like, I haven't slept well several days this week, and there's just a couple things that are really like weighing on me. He's like, well, can I pray for you right now? And I said, no, I'm the pastor. No, it's not what I said. I said, yeah, you can pray for me. Let's do it right now. And we did it. We did it. Normally before service, Mr. Jerry Morris, if you know him, what a man of God, he feels this conviction to pray for me before every service. Well, he's out of town, so he's asked John McElroy to pray for me, and John made sure to do it. I got prayed for by Father and Son today, double prayer. Take that, devil, right? But I'm not afraid to say like, man, it's not a good day. I text somebody back this morning who was like, I hope you're having a great weekend. And I'm like, it's okay, but I do have some needs. Thanks for asking. Now they can pray. You wanna know one of the reasons that we don't tell people that we have needs? Because then they're gonna ask, oh, well, how can I pray for you? Can I offer a burden for you to lift off of you? You don't have to tell them every single need in specificity. You can say, got some anxious things happening. I've got people I'm talking to. Depression is coming after me. I'm not gonna let it win, but I'd love you to fight this battle with me. I've been dealing with a lot of anger. Anger's been coming up and I'm not able to get rid of it right away. So, just give them something. If you and I believed prayer the way that we say we do, we would be asking everybody to pray for us. Everybody. I feel lonely. Can you pray for me? I feel angry. Can you pray for me? I'm struggling against lust. Can you pray for me? These are the things that we need to say to other people. This is what separates the church from the rest of the world. As I was studying for the message this week, I've watched way too much television. So the problem is I've watched so much television, I don't really know how to create an illustration out of one show that everybody knows. So I've got three. One of them's been around for years. It's called Undercover Boss. Any fans? Okay, Undercover Boss. The whole premise, if you haven't watched it, it's simple. It's normally the CEO of like a huge company will disguise themselves as an ordinary employee, and they'll spend several days working alongside people on the ground level of their company. And these people on the ground level don't know they're working with like the big boss that they would have never come into contact with. And it's watching the employees reveal who they really are that is actually the most compelling thing whenever I've watched it. It's not been seeing the CEO go, oh, this is the way it is down here. It's seeing how some of them are like, yeah, the boss wants this, but we clock in 15 minutes late. The people that cut corners there, or the ones that are like, yeah, I don't do that. Nobody sees it, but integrity matters. And they normally go out of their way to highlight both sides of it. It's the people that say it's the right thing to do, and I'm paid to do a job. And normally those people, they're in for a really good surprise by the end of it when they realize they've been working with their boss. But by the end of the episode, it's that person, the one who took the time to know the new person standing in front of them, instead of making assumptions about them, that walks away with the greatest reward. They went and they tried to equip and train their boss's 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 boss, because that was a new person and they knew what it was like to be new. If you don't watch Undercover Boss, we'll go for a little bit of an earlier generation. I grew up on a little show called Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers spent decades teaching children something that the world still hasn't learned. He believed that behavior always has a story behind it. And so he was asked one time, like, how do you handle these difficult children? Well, he said, instead of asking what's wrong with this person, I just ask, what has this person been through? It doesn't mean you let them continue to do what they're doing, but once you understand them, once you ask a better question, it's harder to be just angry and dismissive over somebody. When you know their story and their struggle, it's totally different. I'm sorry if those two shows didn't hit you. How about Ted Lasso? Any fans of Ted Lasso? I know it's a church, you can say it. Lots of swear words, it's all right. If you've seen that show though, one of the most famous lines is, be curious, not judgmental. And the show credits that to Walt Whitman, but there is no evidence that that's true. But it's still a great quote. He's somebody who is an outsider, and there he decides to become curious even though people aren't really curious about him. It's interesting that these three completely different television shows made for three different audiences all landed on the same principle. One through a CEO in disguise, one through a gentle neighbor talking to children, and one through an optimistic soccer coach. All of them in their own way are reminding us that people are almost always more complicated than our first impression would allow us to believe. And the difference here is that Jesus didn't just teach that principle, he lived it out perfectly. Over and over again, Jesus chose to slow down and engage with people and ask them questions. He didn't need the information, but because people needed to know that they had been seen before they had been evaluated, even though he's the one that could do it. You remember the woman that's caught in adultery and they're all ready to stone her? And he said, all right, well, whoever's without sin, go ahead and throw the first stone, which is really kind of cool when you realize, oh, there was somebody without sin there. Because Jesus could have thrown that first stone. I mean, I want you to think about it. If immediately after that he said, he who's without sin, throw the first stone, all he had to do was throw one stone and they would all be justified in murdering her. And instead he waited. You without sin? You want to go first? You don't want to? How about you? You want to? No? And one by one it says they all walked away. He asked questions. But then what did he say to her? At the end, he said, go and sin no more. He didn't let them do whatever they wanted, but he wanted them to know that they mattered. One of the reasons I love the way that Jesus interacted with people is because he didn't just give us something to believe, he gave us something that we can practice. We can do this too. I wonder what would happen if this week, every time we were tempted to assume somebody's motives, we intentionally replaced our assumption with a better question. So let's take a look at some of the better questions. Instead of saying, I know why they did that, how about we ask, what information am I missing? That question would save us a lot of relationships because we almost never possess the whole story. We know what someone said or what they did, but we almost never know what happened before they walked into the room or how that day or that week had been going. But humility recognizes that your perspective is always incomplete. Always incomplete. Another question worth asking is this: have I talked to the person or have I only talked about the person? And this sounds like, yeah, I know that. Well, if we knew that, we would walk it out. One of the easiest traps for churches to fall into is this: we process somebody's decisions with everyone except the person who actually made them. And it starts with, I need counsel, I need advice, I need prayer, can you help me walk through this? And then we ask all of these people. And then months later, it's like, oh, did you talk to that person? Oh, no, I appreciate you following up. I decided it wasn't worth it. Well, it was worth it. 1, 2, 3 people in a row. Did you talk about them or did you talk to them? Third question to ask yourself is this: am I trying to understand or am I trying to be right? Most of us are insecure. And because we're insecure, when we go to people, we want to hear that we're right. We want to hear that we made the right decision. We want to hear that it was right to make distance from that person, or it was right to say that to them, or, yeah, you could have done that better, but, oh man, that word but gets us in a lot of trouble, doesn't it? These are two different pursuits. If your goal is simply to prove your conclusion, I'll only listen for evidence that supports what I already believe. But if my goal is understanding, I'll listen differently because I'll ask better questions and I'll leave room for the possibility that I don't know everything yet. And the last thing is this. This is important. If someone were making assumptions about me today, what would I hope that they do? Why don't you think about that? Maybe you already have somebody in mind that you think might have judged you in this room. I don't know. And you leave today. If you found out that they had an assumption about you, what would you want them to do? And I think for most of us, we would say, well, I'd want them to ask me about it. If that's what you'd want them to do, guess what you should do? Do unto others or whatever. I have a feeling every one of us knows the answer to that one. Matthew 7:12 says, do to others whatever you'd like them to do to you. That's a pretty simple command. Don't get me wrong, it's difficult, but it is simple, isn't it? Here's what I've learned after a lot of years of ministry. Very few church conflicts begin with bad theology. Many of them begin with bad assumptions. Somebody will leave a church faster over a fight with another person than they will over a theological point they disagree with. Isn't that something? I wonder how many churches could stay whole and not split if people would learn to ask one more question. There's a lot of power in that number one. Before we end this morning, I want to go back to the very beginning and show you in Genesis 3 something. And I need you to know that for this whole series, even though we end it next week by talking about pride, which is the sin under all other sins, I want you to understand this is the message I was waiting to get to. This is the heart of it. We've got some spiritual warfare that is coming up. We've got some spiritual messages, some supernatural things that happen in the Bible that we're going to be unpacking. And I just need you to know that these little sins that we allow in, even though we belong to Jesus, we're washed by the blood, we're going to heaven, but we allow these things in, these are the things that are allowing the devil to have a foothold and to get into our lives. If you want to go to war the way you're supposed to and not be like Eliab and all these other people standing there staring at a giant but not doing anything about it, if you want to be like David that says, what makes them think they can get away with this? If you want to push back darkness in Eastern North Carolina, in your family, in your home, and I hope you'll join me with this is where we're going. But I want you to see this from all the way back in the beginning. Genesis 3, starting in verse 7. This is right after original sin. It says, at that moment, their eyes were opened. This is Adam and Eve, and they suddenly felt shame at their nakedness. So they sewed fig leaves together to cover themselves. Which is interesting. I wonder if they had done any sewing before this. We don't have any evidence of it. And if you've ever seen fig leaves, they don't seem like the best option if you're trying to cover yourself. When the cool evening breezes were blowing, the man and his wife heard the Lord God walking about in the garden, so they hid from the Lord God among the trees. Do you understand how heartbreaking that sentence is? Every single evening, the Lord came to the garden and walked with them. Every single evening. Remember the old hymn? And he walks with me. This is where it comes from. For the very first time, God shows up, and they're not there. Then the Lord God called to the man, where are you? Oh, look at this discernment, asking a good question, even though he knew where he was. Adam replied, I heard you walking in the garden, so I hid. I was afraid because I was naked. Who told you that you're naked? The Lord God asked, have you eaten from the tree whose fruit I commanded you not to eat? Here's what's interesting. That fruit is what opened their eyes. There's a lot we can unpack from that. Why didn't the devil just slide on up there as a serpent and say, hey, did you know you're naked? We can see everything. What's the concept of naked? There was no concept of naked or clothed because there was no concept of shame. And all of a sudden, man and woman became self-conscious. It's the worst thing that could have happened to them. It was all about God and his gifts and his garden. And all of a sudden, now it was about Adam and Eve and their garden and their condition. And as their heavenly Father showed up to be with them, their first thought wasn't, we need to spend time with them. Their first thought wasn't, oh good, God's here. God, we did something terrible and now we know we're naked. Can you help us? They took it into their own hands. This is what we do. And when we feel shame, we try to cover our shame, normally through judgmentalism. Whatever we're dealing with, whatever we're ashamed of, we tend to look out at somebody else and say, well, at least I'm not them. I say it kind of as a mostly joke, but when people are like, oh, I can't believe you watch WWE. You know it's scripted, right? And I'm like, well, good. I hope you don't watch anything that has a script. But I'll normally say something like this. Yeah, but you know what? Those characters, they're kind of messed up, but those are problems I don't have to solve. It's sort of like a release for me. And you may be sitting here right now saying like, well, I don't think a Christian should watch that. Don't you judge me, all right? The first inclination Adam and Eve had was to cover themselves with their solution, what they thought would help them. I wonder if that's why so much of our judgmentalism today comes from our own weaknesses. We spend so much time measuring everybody else because we're already constantly measuring ourselves. We don't know how to be good and kind and fair to ourselves, so we sure don't know how to do it for other people that exist outside of our body. The gospel doesn't work like this, though. One more verse, it's in that same chapter, Genesis 3, verse 21. And the Lord God made clothing from animal skins for Adam and his wife. You know how beautiful that is? Adam and Eve tried to cover themselves, and then God truly covered them and took care of what they were self-conscious about. The fig leaves weren't enough because fig leaves are never meant to save anybody. They were trying to solve a problem that only God could solve. Is that not the story of the entire Bible? Is that not our story? We're trying to solve the problems that only God can solve. Humanity has spent thousands of years trying to cover sin with performance and religion and comparison and morality and good works. And then Jesus comes and does for us what we could have never done for ourselves. And that is why judgmentalism is so dangerous. Every single time I appoint myself as the judge over someone else's heart, I have forgotten that I am standing in front of them, but one day I'll be standing in front of God in his presence, and not because I judged correctly, but because Jesus covered me. It reminds me that every person I meet is somebody Jesus died to redeem, not someone for me to evaluate. So here's what I'd like for all of us to do this week. This is your actual homework. I want you to pay attention to the stories you tell yourself. When you're sitting alone and your mind starts going, the next time somebody disappoints you, the next time your husband or your wife lets you down, next time your mom or your dad says something and you're like, that's what he always does. Nope, stop yourself. Pay attention to the story that you're telling yourself. Anytime something rubs you the wrong way, resist the temptation to finish the story in your mind. Instead, ask yourself one question: do I actually know this, or have I assumed it? If it's someone that you have a relationship with, I want you to have the courage to replace one assumption with one conversation. One conversation. Hey, you probably didn't mean anything by that, but when you said this, it kind of hit me the wrong way. Maybe they didn't mean anything by it, but you know what they just learned? I shouldn't say that to them. Normally, we have more than one conversation about people when we assume, so we might as well just replace all of those conversations with just one with the actual person. I have a feeling that that decision could save our friendships and our marriages and our families. And I really think it would preserve the unity of this church too. I'll just close by telling you this. I really want Liberty to be known as a church that loves the truth enough to pursue it, but also loves people enough to hear from them before judging them. And I want us to become the kind of church where people know that they're going to be listened to before they're labeled, because underneath envy and bitterness and anger and even judgmentalism is one sin that consistently feeds them all, and it's pride. It's when we look at everything through the filter of ourselves, and we'll talk about that next week. Would y'all stand up as we close in worship this morning?